Welcome to Revenge with Roman, the place where betrayal meets justice and every twist cuts deeper than the last. Today's story carries a storm of heartbreak, deceit, and a reckoning no one saw coming. High Voltage, the title. She planned to shatter my life, but her own plan backfired. Imagine giving your trust, your love, and your future to someone you thought was your everything, only to discover that behind every smile was a trap, carefully laid out to destroy you. She thought she could break me, humiliate me, and walk away untouched. But what she didn't know was that the same blade she sharpened for me was the one that would cut her down. David had always been a man of quiet determination, the kind of person who let his actions speak louder than words. At 37, he had built a life that many envied but few truly understood. Growing up in a small town, he had faced more obstacles than most people would encounter in a lifetime. His father had left when he was barely a boy, leaving his mother to raise him and his younger sister alone, juggling multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. David had seen the worry etched on his mother's face, the exhaustion in her eyes, and he made a silent promise to himself that he would never let circumstances dictate his future. From an early age, he understood the value of hard work, resilience, and integrity. These were not just lessons taught to him. They were etched into the fabric of his being, shaping his every decision and action. In school, David was not the most popular student, nor the one who excelled at sports or music. Instead, he had a quiet brilliance, a way of observing the world that made him thoughtful beyond his years. He excelled academically, not for recognition, but because he knew that knowledge was his ticket out of the struggles that had defined his childhood. While other kids played without worry, David spent hours after school helping his mother at the small family shop and tutoring younger students to earn extra money. There was a discipline to his life that others often found suffocating, but for him, it was a necessary foundation. Every small victory, every dollar saved, every skill mastered was a step toward the future he was determined to claim for himself. By the time he graduated, David had a scholarship to a reputable university, something he achieved not by luck, but by sheer perseverance and an unyielding work ethic. College was a new world, one filled with opportunities he had never dreamed of as a child. He threw himself into his studies with the same intensity he had applied to every challenge in his life. While many of his peers partied or wasted their time, David worked part-time jobs and participated in internships that would give him real-world experience. It was not an easy path. He faced nights of exhaustion, moments of doubt, and times when the weight of his responsibilities felt unbearable. Yet, he never wavered. He had a vision of the life he wanted to build, and he refused to let anything or anyone distract him from that vision. After graduating, David moved to the city with nothing but a suitcase, a few personal belongings, and the skills he had painstakingly honed over the years. The city was a place of both promise and peril. Opportunities were abundant, but so were challenges, and David quickly learned that success here required more than just talent. It required strategy, patience, and a keen sense of judgment. He started working in a modest position at a small company, but he approached every task with the same meticulous care that had guided him all his life. He earned the respect of his colleagues not through charm or charisma, but through reliability, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. In parallel with his professional life, David nurtured a personal code that set him apart. He valued honesty, loyalty, and kindness above all else. He believed in fairness, in standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves, and in maintaining dignity even when circumstances were harsh. This moral compass guided his decisions, both in business and in life, and it became a part of his identity. People who knew him often described David as someone you could trust with your life, someone whose word was as solid as any contract, and someone whose presence brought a quiet sense of reassurance. Over the years, David's career flourished, but he never allowed success to cloud his perspective. He remembered the struggles of his past, the nights of worry, the sacrifices made by his mother, and he remained grounded. He invested wisely, expanded his business endeavors with careful planning, and built a network of trusted friends and colleagues who shared his values. Despite the pressures and temptations that often accompany wealth and influence, David maintained a balance between ambition and integrity. He understood that true success was not measured solely by financial gain or social status, but by the ability to remain true to oneself, to navigate life's challenges with honor, and create a foundation that could withstand both triumph and adversity. Even in his personal life, David approached relationships with the same thoughtful care he applied to every other aspect of his existence. He valued deep connections over superficial ones, loyalty over convenience, and love that was rooted in respect and understanding. Those who entered his life were treated with genuine attention and sincerity, and he expected the same in return. He had experienced betrayal and disappointment in the past, but each experience had strengthened his resolve rather than breaking it. He had learned to read people carefully, to trust wisely, and to recognize the difference between fleeting charm and true character. By the age of 37, David had achieved a balance that many spent a lifetime chasing. He had built a successful career, a stable financial foundation, and a personal life guided by principles he held dear. He carried himself with quiet confidence, a confidence born not of arrogance but of experience, resilience, and self-awareness. Every challenge he had faced, every obstacle he had overcome, had contributed to the man he had become, a man capable of navigating life's complexities with intelligence, patience, and unwavering strength. David's story was one of perseverance, integrity, and vision. It was a story of a man who had faced adversity, made sacrifices, and refused to let circumstances define him. He had learned to trust, to work hard, and to hold himself accountable for his own destiny. And while the world outside often seemed unpredictable and cruel, David moved forward with a certainty that, with determination and careful planning, he could shape his own path and overcome any challenge that came his way. David's life had been carefully built, every step deliberate, every decision calculated. But then Clara entered the picture. She appeared effortlessly captivating. The kind of woman whose smile could light up a room and whose laughter carried a magnetic charm that drew people in. At first, she seemed like a breath of fresh air, a contrast to the hardships and routine David had grown accustomed to. Clara was intelligent, witty, and attentive, seeming genuinely interested in every detail of his life. She asked questions that revealed not just curiosity but insight, as though she could see layers of him that no one else had noticed. Her presence was intoxicating. It felt as though she could fill the empty spaces he had learned to live with, offering warmth and excitement that he hadn't realized he was missing. But beneath the charm, beneath the smiles and the carefully chosen words, there was a subtle undercurrent of something darker. David, despite his years of experience and keen perception, initially overlooked the small inconsistencies, the fleeting flashes of calculation in her eyes, and the occasional slip of a carefully constructed facade. Clara had a talent for making everything seem spontaneous, genuine, and natural, yet her every action was meticulously designed. She could adapt seamlessly to any situation, blending her true intentions with the expectations of those around her, ensuring that she remained not only trusted but admired. As David and Clara grew closer, she began to integrate herself into his routines, his friendships, and even his professional circles. It started with simple gestures, remembering small details he had casually mentioned, showing up at events just when he needed support, offering advice that seemed thoughtful and insightful. Her influence was subtle but undeniable. People around him noticed her charm, often commenting on how well they seemed to complement each other, unaware that beneath the surface, Clara's motivations were far from innocent. David, however, was not easily deceived. His years of experience with people, his innate ability to read intentions, and his disciplined judgment allowed him to sense that something was off, even if he could not yet identify it clearly. There were moments, a carefully worded suggestion, a lingering gaze, a question that seemed too probing, when a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Yet, her charisma was powerful, and he found himself drawn in, wanting to believe in the goodness he so often sought in others. Clara had mastered the art of presenting herself as a partner, a confidant, and a kindred spirit, making it nearly impossible to distinguish between genuine affection and calculated manipulation. Their relationship grew with a speed and intensity that was exhilarating yet disorienting. David, who had always been cautious, found himself swept along by the allure of someone who seemed to understand him so completely. Clara became a constant presence in his life, accompanying him on business trips, attending gatherings, and sharing personal moments that would typically require years of trust to reach. Friends and colleagues remarked on how natural they seemed together, unaware that behind the surface of connection lay a strategy designed to entangle, control, and exploit. What made Clara particularly dangerous was her ability to mirror David's values and aspirations, presenting herself as an ally who shared his vision for the future. She knew when to listen, when to advise, and when to act with subtle persuasion, all while concealing her true intentions. Her charm was not just superficial. It was a tool she wielded with precision, a mask behind which her manipulative side operated with careful calculation. She could make him feel seen and understood, all the while steering events and decisions toward outcomes that served her hidden agenda. David's initial admiration gradually shifted into a complex mix of fascination and wariness. He found himself compelled by her presence, yet he sensed that beneath the allure was a mind that worked in shadows, plotting and scheming in ways that were not immediately visible. Clara had a rare combination of intelligence, emotional insight, and ambition that made her simultaneously irresistible and potentially dangerous. Every interaction, every shared moment, was a careful dance between attraction and subtle power, with Clara always leading, always guiding, yet always appearing to be supportive. By the time David fully realized the depth of her influence, Clara had already woven herself intricately into the fabric of his life. Her charm was no longer just an external trait. It was a mechanism that allowed her to manipulate perceptions, influence decisions, and slowly gain control over aspects of his life that he had once guarded closely. Her manipulative tendencies were hidden beneath layers of affection, attention, and apparent devotion, making it almost impossible for anyone, including David, to see the true nature of her intentions without stepping back and observing with ruthless clarity. In essence, Clara was a perfect storm of allure and danger, a person who could inspire trust while quietly orchestrating schemes that threatened everything David had built. Their meeting marked the beginning of a journey that would test his judgment, his resilience, and ultimately, his capacity for revenge. Once Clara had captured David's attention, she moved with a calculated patience, carefully embedding herself into the rhythms of his life. At first, it was subtle. A dinner together after a long day, a supportive text when he faced a challenge, a compliment that seemed innocent but lingered in his mind longer than it should have. She listened with what seemed like genuine interest, remembering not only the details he shared but the emotions attached to them, as if cataloging them for some deeper purpose. David, who had always valued sincerity and connection, found himself opening up in ways he rarely had before. He shared stories of his past, dreams for his future, and even the private fears he had long buried, believing that Clara's empathy was authentic. Her integration into his life was gradual yet thorough. Clara began attending professional meetings with him, ostensibly to support him, but also to observe how he interacted with colleagues, how decisions were made, and where potential vulnerabilities might lie. She became a familiar presence among his friends, charming them effortlessly, earning their trust and admiration, and subtly influencing their opinions in ways that always seemed beneficial to David. He noticed the way she could smooth over tense moments, how she could persuade or redirect conversations with a simple word or gesture, and he found himself relying on her more than he realized. At home, her presence grew equally influential. Clara learned the smallest details about his routines, his habits, and the way he managed his household. She offered to help with tasks that seemed minor at first, organizing documents, suggesting financial decisions, even managing social interactions. But each act, though seemingly thoughtful, was a step toward deeper involvement. David, proud of the life he had built, began to trust her judgment implicitly, often consulting her on matters he would have previously handled alone. Her influence became woven into his decisions so seamlessly that he barely noticed the subtle shifts in control. Even in moments of vulnerability, Clara's manipulative skill was apparent. She knew when to comfort, when to challenge, and when to withdraw just enough to create longing and dependence. Her words were carefully chosen, her gestures intentional, and her smiles timed perfectly to reinforce a sense of connection and loyalty. David, unaware of the underlying strategy, felt as though he had found a partner who not only understood him but enhanced every aspect of his life. He began to see her as indispensable, a presence that added both stability and excitement, never suspecting that each layer of trust she built was part of meticulous design. Clara's control extended into his professional sphere as well. She offered insights into his business decisions, suggested changes in strategy, and positioned herself as a valuable confidant. Her recommendations often seemed astute and beneficial, earning the respect of colleagues and clients alike. David, who prided himself on discernment, found her counsel surprisingly effective, unaware that each suggestion was subtly steering him toward outcomes that she could later exploit. She had mastered the art of making influence invisible, ensuring that her involvement always appeared as helpful guidance rather than calculated manipulation. Her emotional intelligence was perhaps her most potent weapon. Clara could read moods, anticipate reactions, and adjust her behavior to maintain trust and admiration. She celebrated his successes with apparent joy, empathized with his disappointments, and offered comfort in ways that felt deeply personal. This emotional attunement created a bond that was difficult for David to question. He began to depend on her not only for advice and companionship, but also for emotional stability, believing that their partnership was founded on mutual respect and understanding. By the time David fully acknowledged how integral Clara had become to his life, she had achieved a presence that was nearly total. She was involved in social, professional, and personal domains, seamlessly connecting herself to every facet of his existence. Her influence was no longer subtle. It had become foundational. He relied on her opinions, her judgment, and her presence in ways he had never relied on anyone before. And while he felt gratitude and affection, he remained blissfully unaware that every act of trust, every shared secret, and every decision made under her guidance was a thread in a web she was weaving with precise intent. Clara's strategy was patient, relentless, and invisible to the untrained eye. She had gained more than trust. She had secured access, influence, and authority over the life David had spent decades building. She had become indispensable not through coercion or force, but through charm, intelligence, and subtle manipulation. David's world, which had once been firmly under his own control, was slowly being shaped to fit the contours of her hidden ambitions, a reality he had yet to glimpse even as he celebrated the joy of having seemingly found the perfect partner. While David believed he found a supportive partner in Clara, her mind was already working on a completely different plan, one that would dismantle everything he had worked so hard to build. Behind the warmth, laughter, and apparent devotion lay a meticulous strategy, carefully crafted to exploit his trust and ambition. Clara had observed him closely, noting not only his strengths, but also his vulnerabilities, the small cracks in his otherwise disciplined life. She knew how much he valued his reputation, the pride he took in his work, and the respect he commanded among colleagues and friends. These were the very things she aimed to destroy, one calculated move at a time. Her plan was multifaceted, blending subtle manipulation with carefully orchestrated sabotage. She began by planting seeds of doubt among those closest to David, using charm and carefully chosen words to influence their perceptions without ever revealing her hand. She would casually question his decisions, suggest that he was overlooking risks, and insinuate that certain colleagues or business partners might not have his best interests at heart. To an outside observer, these seemed like friendly suggestions, almost protective advice from a concerned partner. But each comment was designed to erode confidence, create uncertainty, and slowly isolate David from the very people he trusted. Clara's manipulation extended beyond social influence into more concrete, tangible actions. She started creating situations that would appear as mistakes or oversights on David's part, mismanaged projects, delayed communications, and minor financial missteps that, when pieced together, could paint a picture of incompetence. She leveraged her access to his work life, gaining insight into critical documents, meetings, and decision-making processes, always staying one step ahead, so that she could subtly steer events to her advantage. Her interference was invisible at first, so small and well-timed that David never suspected she could be orchestrating anything malicious. In parallel, Clara cultivated her own alliances, connecting with people in David's professional circle who were ambitious or dissatisfied, presenting herself as a supportive and insightful confidant while secretly enlisting their assistance. She built a network of influence around him, ensuring that when the time came, she would have leverage over multiple aspects of his business and reputation. Every relationship she nurtured, every subtle suggestion she made, was part of a larger scheme to weaken David's position while strengthening her own. Her motives were not merely financial or professional. They were deeply personal. Clara thrived on control, on the sense of power that came from manipulating someone who believed in her implicitly. She saw David's trust as both a challenge and an opportunity, a fortress of integrity to infiltrate and bend to her will. Every smile, Every gesture of affection was a calculated move designed to reinforce her image while advancing her secret agenda. She understood psychology, human behavior, and strategy, and she wielded these tools with precision, turning them into instruments of betrayal. What made her plan particularly dangerous was its subtlety. Clara knew that a direct attack would raise alarms immediately, but an invisible, incremental undermining would go unnoticed until the damage was irreparable. She timed every step with care, ensuring that each incident, each misstep, and each doubt planted would feel like an accident, a coincidence, or a natural outcome of circumstances. To the outside world, David's reputation would erode gradually, and no one would suspect the woman who stood by him, seemingly devoted and supportive, was the architect of his downfall. Even as she executed her strategy, Clara maintained the appearance of loyalty and love. She laughed at his jokes, supported his ideas, and comforted him during stressful moments, all while continuing to weave the intricate web of deceit around him. Her duality was flawless. Publicly, she was a perfect partner. Privately, she was a silent adversary, orchestrating a future where David would lose everything he valued most. In essence, Clara had mastered the art of invisible warfare. She had studied David, understood his world, and devised a plan that would exploit both his trust and his humanity. She knew that the heart, once betrayed, was powerless to resist the consequences of a carefully executed scheme. And as she continued to embed herself deeper into his life, she did so with a certainty that, when the moment came, she would have not only control but victory over everything he had built. For months, David had trusted Clara completely, believing that her presence was a source of support and stability. But subtle cracks began to appear, small anomalies that gnawed at his intuition. It started with minor incidents at work, important emails disappearing, meetings rescheduled without explanation, and miscommunications with clients that left him frustrated and confused. At first, he blamed himself, thinking he had overlooked something or made a simple mistake. But the pattern persisted, and the frequency of these incidents grew, making it increasingly difficult to dismiss them as mere coincidence. At home, he noticed things he couldn't explain. Personal items moved slightly, documents misplaced, and occasional discrepancies in his finances. Clara remained cheerful, attentive, and seemingly unconcerned, often offering plausible explanations that at first satisfied him. Yet a small, persistent unease began to settle in his mind. David prided himself on being observant and cautious, and despite his affection for Clara, he could not ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Each incident, however minor, felt like a piece of a larger puzzle he could not yet see. Friends and colleagues began mentioning odd interactions or changes they had noticed in him, missed opportunities, delayed responses, or subtle shifts in his demeanor. David tried to rationalize these concerns, dismissing them as stress from his demanding career. But inside, a quiet alarm was sounding. He couldn't shake the sense that someone was meddling in his life in ways he had not anticipated. Each unusual event triggered memories of earlier inconsistencies he had overlooked, and slowly, a chilling possibility began to form in his mind. Perhaps these disruptions were not random at all. The losses, both big and small, started to accumulate. Business deals that had seemed secure fell through unexpectedly. Contracts went missing, and important financial decisions were undermined in ways that cost him both money and credibility. His employees, sensing tension, grew anxious, and David realized that his reputation, painstakingly built over decades, was subtly eroding. The sudden setbacks were unlike anything he had experienced before, leaving him both frustrated and increasingly suspicious. David's observations sharpened. He began paying closer attention to his surroundings, noticing patterns and inconsistencies that previously would have escaped him. Every misstep, every unexplained issue, began to point toward a hidden hand influencing his life. While he still lacked concrete proof, his instincts told him that the very foundation of trust he had placed in Clara might be compromised. The betrayal, he sensed, was closer and more intimate than he had ever feared. At the same time, Clara maintained her facade flawlessly. She smiled, offered comfort, and reassured him during moments of doubt, all while the disruptions continued. Her ability to remain calm and supportive while chaos unfolded around him made it even harder for David to pinpoint the source of his troubles. The contrast between her apparent devotion and the mounting setbacks created a disorienting tension, an emotional tug-of-war that left him questioning his judgment and the reality he thought he knew. David's growing awareness forced him into a state of cautious observation. He started documenting events, noting timelines, and tracking interactions with both colleagues and Clara herself. His analytical mind, honed by years of disciplined work, began to see the emerging patterns, connecting incidents that previously seemed unrelated. Each revelation was like a small spark in the dark, illuminating the shadow of betrayal that had been creeping into his life. The emotional weight of this realization was heavy. David had always been a man who trusted deeply and acted with integrity. The notion that someone so close, someone he had allowed into the core of his life, might be undermining him was almost unbearable. Anger, confusion, and a growing sense of determination mingled within him, fueling both caution and resolve. He could no longer afford to act naively. The stakes had escalated, and he understood that survival and eventually justice would require vigilance, strategy, and patience. By the time David truly grasped the extent of the unusual betrayals and losses surrounding him, he realized that he was facing an enemy who was not external, but intimately embedded within his life. The unsettling question was no longer if he was being undermined, but how far Clara's hidden ambitions had reached, and how much of the life he had built was now at risk. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not only his intelligence and resilience, but his capacity for measured, deliberate revenge. David had been noticing the strange betrayals and subtle disruptions for weeks, his unease growing into a quiet obsession. He began to piece together the anomalies, the misplaced documents, the miscommunications with clients, the small financial inconsistencies, and a pattern started to emerge. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't bad luck. Someone was deliberately undermining him. And as his mind sifted through the possibilities, an unbearable truth began to crystallize. Clara, the woman he had trusted with his heart and his life, was at the center of it all. The revelation came unexpectedly. One late evening, David was going through some old emails and documents he had stored for reference. He was meticulous, methodical, reviewing every transaction and correspondence for clarity when he stumbled upon a thread he hadn't noticed before. A series of communications, cleverly hidden and carefully worded, exposed Clara's coordination with several of his business associates. The emails revealed her manipulation, plans to divert contracts, spread false information about his decisions, and subtly position herself as indispensable in ways that would ultimately leave David isolated and discredited. Shock coursed through him as he absorbed the magnitude of what he had uncovered. Clara's schemes were more extensive and meticulously planned than he could have imagined. She hadn't acted in haste. Everything had been calculated over months, designed to erode his reputation slowly while keeping herself above suspicion. Every helpful suggestion, every word of advice, every gesture of affection had been a part of this intricate deception. The realization was almost too much to bear. He had been living under a carefully constructed illusion, one that had allowed her to infiltrate every aspect of his life without raising even a hint of alarm. As he delved deeper, David found evidence that Clara had been forging alliances, quietly influencing colleagues, and creating circumstances that would force him into positions of vulnerability. She had used her charm and intelligence to manipulate perception, making him appear incompetent or distracted others while simultaneously positioning herself as the indispensable partner who could guide him. The betrayal was not only personal but professional, a threat to everything he had worked so tirelessly to build. The emotional impact was devastating. David felt a storm of anger, disbelief, and hurt, knowing that someone he had trusted implicitly had been planning his downfall all along. Every memory of shared moments, every smile and comforting gesture, now carried the bitter weight of deception. He wrestled with the intensity of betrayal, his mind spinning with the questions that demanded answers. How could he have been so blind? How could someone so close harbor such intentions without a single slip? And most importantly, what could he do to reclaim his life and expose her treachery? But even amid the shock, a spark of clarity ignited within him. David was not a man who could be broken so easily. The very skills, discipline, and resilience that had allowed him to build a successful life now became tools for confronting this treachery. He began to strategize, carefully considering each piece of evidence, understanding the depth of Clara's manipulations, and planning his next moves with meticulous precision. He realized that confronting her directly in haste could be dangerous. She was cunning, and any misstep could play into her hands. Instead, he resolved to turn her own schemes against her, using the knowledge he had gathered to orchestrate a reversal that would leave her exposed and powerless. As David processed the extent of Clara's betrayal, he also began to notice subtle mistakes she had made, overlooked details, minor inconsistencies, and patterns that, when connected, provided him with leverage. These were the cracks in her carefully constructed facade, the footholds he could exploit to reclaim control over his life and his reputation. The realization was empowering. He understood that although the betrayal had been personal, it had also given him insight into her methods, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. By the end of that night, David's sense of shock had transformed into determination. Clara's manipulation, once invisible, had been revealed, and with it came the understanding that the scales could be tipped back in his favor. The discovery was not just a revelation of deceit. It was a catalyst for a meticulously planned response, one that would require patience, cunning, and a willingness to confront betrayal in the most calculated way possible. With the full extent of Clara's betrayal laid bare before him, David knew that a direct confrontation would be premature. She was clever, manipulative, and dangerously perceptive. Any sudden move could alert her, allowing her to cover her tracks or strike first. Instead, he decided to use patience and strategy as his weapons. Outwardly, he maintained the appearance of trust and affection, continuing to engage with Clara as if unaware of her schemes. He smiled, laughed, and shared conversations with her, all while meticulously documenting her actions and planning the countermeasures that would eventually dismantle her plans. Every interaction became a calculated performance. When Clara suggested business decisions that favored her hidden agenda, David acted as though he were considering them seriously, asking questions and nodding thoughtfully. He encouraged her to reveal more of her strategy, all the while noting every inconsistency and subtle manipulation. His outward compliance was convincing. Clara, confident in her control, had no reason to suspect that he was aware of her deception. Each time she tried to isolate him from colleagues, undermine his reputation, or gain leverage, David responded in ways that seemed naive but were actually part of a larger, carefully orchestrated plan. David also began reinforcing his own position discreetly. He quietly secured sensitive documents, backed up communications, and alerted trusted allies about the possibility of internal manipulation without exposing Clara. He reviewed contracts, financial transactions, and emails, searching for patterns and weaknesses he could exploit. Every piece of information became a tool, every error on Clara's part a potential turning point. His mind operated like a precise machine, balancing patience with strategic foresight, knowing that timing would be critical in executing his revenge. Emotionally, the charade was difficult. Pretending to trust someone who betrayed him so deeply required restraint, control, and a careful suppression of anger. Yet David understood that his true strength lay in discipline and foresight. By masking his awareness, he forced Clara to continue revealing her intentions, giving him the clarity he needed to ensure that her downfall would be total and undeniable. The anger that burned within him became fuel, sharpening his focus rather than clouding his judgment. He also tested her subtly, presenting minor opportunities for her to manipulate situations while he observed her responses. Each trial allowed him to measure her cunning, predict her moves, and anticipate the next step in her plan. He watched her closely, noting every hesitation, every overconfidence, and every slight miscalculation. Clara, unaware that she was being studied, continued to believe she was in control, unwittingly supplying him with all the ammunition he would need. Socially, David maintained the illusion of harmony. He praised her contributions in public, included her in important discussions, and behaved in ways that reinforced her belief in his obliviousness. Friends, colleagues, and associates saw only a loving couple, completely unaware of the underlying tension and the silent battle being waged behind closed doors. This dual reality gave David a strategic advantage. Clara's manipulations were unfolding in plain sight, yet no one suspected her duplicity or his awareness. Every move David made was a careful blend of patience, subtlety, and precision. He knew that the ultimate goal was not just to expose Clara, but to do so in a way that preserved his integrity, restored his reputation, and ensured that she faced the full consequences of her betrayal. The charade required immense self-control, but it also provided him with the advantage of allowing Clara to continue revealing her plans in their entirety. Deep down, David understood that revenge, to be truly effective, required timing and evidence. Acting prematurely could compromise his efforts, but patience would allow him to strike decisively, leaving no room for her to escape accountability. Every smile he offered, every agreement he feigned, and every act of apparent trust was part of a larger strategy, a carefully choreographed dance that would ultimately place Clara exactly where he wanted her, vulnerable, exposed, and powerless. The day David had been preparing for, quietly for weeks, finally arrived. Every moment of careful observation, every subtle test, and every document he had secured converged into the perfect opportunity to turn the tables. Clara, still confident in her perceived control, continued her manipulations, unaware that David had collected irrefutable evidence of every deceitful act, every scheme, and every betrayal. Her meticulous planning, which she had believed would ensure her victory, had instead given the keys to dismantle her empire of lies. David orchestrated the exposure with precision. He selected a moment when the maximum number of stakeholders, colleagues, business partners, and close acquaintances would be present, ensuring that the revelation would have the widest possible impact. With calm authority, he presented the evidence he had gathered, emails, recordings, and financial regularities, each piece clearly showing Clara's manipulations and deliberate attempts to undermine him. There was no ambiguity, no room for excuses. Every lie she had told, every action taken in secret, was laid bare for everyone to see. The room fell into stunned silence as the truth emerged. Clara's carefully constructed persona of loyalty and support crumbled instantly under the weight of David's proof. Her attempt to deflect, to charm, or to manipulate the narrative failed miserably. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Shock, disbelief, and humiliation washed over her as she realized that the very man she had aimed to destroy had not only uncovered her scheme, but had also turned it against her in the most devastating way. David's revelation was not just a personal vindication. It was a strategic masterstroke. The professional consequences were immediate. Colleagues and business partners who had been unknowingly influenced by Clara's schemes began to see the reality of her manipulations, restoring trust in David and isolating her completely. Her credibility, which she had nurtured so carefully, was shattered, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. Even those who had admired her cunning and charm could no longer deny the evidence before them. Emotionally, David maintained control. He did not gloat, did not allow anger to cloud his delivery. Instead, he presented the truth with measured calm, letting the facts speak for themselves. The contrast between his composure and her unraveling demeanor amplified the impact of the exposure. Clara's charm, once her greatest weapon, was now powerless against the undeniable proof of her betrayal. The very skills she had relied upon to manipulate and control others had been turned against her, leaving her exposed in a way she had never anticipated. Witnessing the collapse of her carefully plotted scheme, David experienced a mixture of vindication and restrained satisfaction. The fear, shame, and confusion on Clara's face were a direct result of her own choices, her own ambition, and her own manipulative actions. Every move she had made to dominate his life and career had been meticulously documented, studied, and used as leverage to ensure that justice, his justice, was served. The power dynamic that she had sought to control had been reversed completely, leaving her powerless to resist the consequences of her actions. The fallout extended beyond the immediate circle. Clara's reputation, once polished and admired, now carried the unmistakable stain of betrayal and deceit. Friends, colleagues, and acquaintances began to distance themselves, recognizing the true nature of her character. Her influence and credibility, which she had wielded like weapons, were stripped away, leaving her isolated and vulnerable. David, meanwhile, regained not only professional standing, but also his personal confidence, knowing that the manipulations he had endured would no longer threaten him. In that moment, it became clear that Clara's ambition had been her undoing. Every scheme she had orchestrated, every deception she had meticulously crafted, had provided David with the tools to ensure her downfall. What she had believed would guarantee her success had instead become a blueprint for her exposure, a series of actions that inevitably led to her spectacular defeat. The reversal was complete. The architect of destruction had become the victim of her own design, and the man she had sought to ruin emerged stronger, wiser, and fully vindicated. After the revelation, the aftermath unfolded like a slow, deliberate reckoning. Clara, once confident and commanding, was now isolated, her reputation in tatters and her influence completely shattered. Every carefully constructed alliance she had nurtured evaporated as colleagues, friends, and business partners realized the depth of her manipulations. The charm and authority she had relied upon to control those around her were now powerless, leaving her exposed to the full weight of the consequences she had earned. No amount of excuses or attempts to manipulate the narrative could reverse the undeniable truth of her actions. David, on the other hand, moved forward with a sense of calm triumph. He didn't gloat or revel in cruelty. His victory was measured and complete. The trust he had once given, the life he had built, and the reputation he had safeguarded were now restored, stronger than ever. Every misstep Clara had forced upon him had been countered. Every deception had been exposed, and every threat she posed had been neutralized. The patience, discipline, and foresight he had employed throughout the ordeal allowed him not only to reclaim what was rightfully his, but to rise above the chaos she had tried to create. In personal and professional circles, David's integrity was reaffirmed. Those who had doubted or been misled by Clara's scheme saw him emerge as a figure of resilience and intelligence, a man who had not only survived betrayal, but had transformed it into an opportunity for justice and clarity. Friends, colleagues, and allies admired his composure, his strategic thinking, and his unwavering moral compass, all of which had guided him through a situation that could have destroyed him. Clara, meanwhile, faced the consequences of her actions in full. Professionally, she was ostracized and discredited, her career prospects severely diminished by the exposure of her schemes. Socially, she encountered the distrust and disdain of those who had once admired her, recognizing that the very person she sought to dominate had turned the tables with skill and precision. The control she had attempted to wield so carefully slipped entirely from her grasp, leaving her powerless to reclaim the life she had sought to manipulate. For David, the final victory was not just about public vindication. It was deeply personal. The betrayal he had endured had cut to the core, challenging not only his trust, but his perception of human character. Yet through patience, strategy, and careful planning, he had transformed the pain and anger into an opportunity to assert justice, restore balance, and protect the life he had built. He walked away knowing that he had not merely defended himself, but had ensured that those who sought to harm him faced the consequences of their actions. As the dust settled, David's life returned to a state of equilibrium, now fortified by the lessons learned and the strength gained from overcoming betrayal. Clara's manipulations, once a source of fear and uncertainty, had become the catalyst for his ultimate triumph. The world he had worked so hard to create remained intact, and his resilience, foresight, and integrity stood as a testament to the man he had always been: strong, wise, and unshakable. In the end, David didn't just survive. He emerged victorious, having reclaimed his life, his reputation, and his peace of mind. Clara's own ambitions and deceit had ensured her downfall, proving that the plans built on betrayal rarely succeed against patience, intelligence, and a determined heart. The story closed not with revenge alone, but with justice, clarity, and the undeniable truth that those who manipulate others often become ensnared by the very schemes they devise.